Good morning, All Souls Community Church. It's Tuesday, April the 21st. And this week we're talking about a topic that most of us don't like to even look at, let alone dive into, and that's mourning. It's something that in the West we don't do well, and yet this idea of lamenting as a gift from God is something that we need to take the time to look at closely. For as we've been studying in the book of Joel, in the context specifically of plagues, in their case, a locust plague, and in our case, coronavirus, God says that the first step to actually dealing with and living through and making the most of time in plague is mourning. Why? Why lamenting? What is it about lamenting that matters? Well, lamenting is how we rail against and agree with God that something's broken that isn't supposed to be broken. So we rail against it. But it's also how we release, how we enter into the boat called sadness and let it take us where it needs to take us. For otherwise we push it down and it injures us and we keep it inside and it explodes out of us. But when we go down that path of actual releasing, of entering in, we realize that our worst fear is untrue, that simply entering into sadness is where we're going to stay, when no, sadness is a means to an end. It's not an end unto itself. Sadness brings us somewhere, to something, or maybe more specifically to someone, the man of sorrows, well acquainted with grief, who gets us, but who's also made a way through. It's this Jesus that we talked about yesterday, and who said from the beginning of his earthly ministry that he has come to fix what's broken in this world. Hallelujah. But it's not just physically in our bodies or with coronavirus and disease, but it's also in our relationships. In fact, the prophet Malachi, the Italian prophet, some people pronounce it Malachi, he said at the end of his book that when the Messiah comes, he was going to turn the hearts of fathers back to their children and children back to their fathers or their parents. And I would venture a guess that in your home, if your home's anything like my home, it hasn't been exactly perfect during the coronavirus quarantine time. There have been moments of friction. There have been moments of headbutting where perhaps some things that in the busyness of life you knew you should have dealt with, but haven't, have come to the forefront as we've been unable to get out and to get away from one another. And I want to encourage you to realize that that conflict is an opportunity. In fact, it's a gift. It's a gift from God. It doesn't feel like a gift, but it is a gift. Why? Because he wants us to mourn what's broken there. He wants us to rail against the teenager who's pushing away simply because they're a teenager, not because they're right, but because they're a teenager. They shouldn't be doing that, but they do that. And so we rail against it. We're like, that feels wrong, because it is wrong. But we also mourn. We mourn the loss of relationship, not just in what we see in them, but in how we've responded. How we've added to the problem rather than taking them to Jesus in the middle of the problem. Do you see? With your siblings, when it's, well, he did, well, she did, and then, but then I should. And we haven't returned good for evil or overcome evil with good. We've returned evil for evil. We've begun to live an eye for an eye, and therefore we've missed the opportunity to see why I feel the way I do when that person acts like that. You see, the people who are closest to us are the ones who can get down deep inside where it hurts the most, and they know the buttons to push, and all of those buttons, those triggers, are opportunities. Opportunities for us to see where I have been trying to live as the one who's in control of my own life, when in fact I've never been in control of my own life. But there is one who is in control, and who's promised to even make a way through that mess, onto more abundant, whole, healed life. In this quarantine time, in this coronavirus, in this plague, our Jesus is interested in turning the hearts of parents back to their children and children back to their parents. Where is he at work in your home, in your life, right now, for that very purpose? You know, in the areas where it feels prickly, those are the opportunities to do what mourning and lamenting is all about. Railing and releasing, entering into that boat and letting the boat of sadness take you where it needs to go. Take you to Jesus, the Prince of Peace, our mighty God, the man of sorrows, well acquainted with our grief. This Tuesday, let me encourage you to mourn with me over the areas in your life, my life, our lives, where our relationships are broken. Ours is the God who says, that's not okay, but that's also not the end of the story. Let's follow our Jesus today. Amen? Have a great day.